Any nation that trades away its prosperity for security will end up losing both.
Here to discuss what it means for America's future, Jillian Melcher, Wall Street Journal editorial page writer, Rebecca Heinrichs, a Hudson Institute senior fellow, and Gina Loudon, a member of the Donald J. Trump for President Advisory Board. Let me start with you, Rebecca. This is not your traditional national security speech or approach. President Trump's talking about border walls, chain migration, and other things. But I think it's always the economy and prosperity, in my mind, have always been linked to national security.
Absolutely. They're completely linked. And so the Trump national security strategy properly expresses that and has a clear-eyed vision of what is necessary to have a strong military, a strong presence abroad, to lead with credibility. And all of that is tied to prosperity, economic prosperity. And he really lays out the problem that we have with China in this regard. So unless we have good trade deals, unless we can get the Chinese to stop stealing intellectual property and stop having unfair trade practices with the United States, it's not going to be a fair playing field, and the United States isn't going to be as strong as it could be.
Yeah, Jillian, but the border wall, for instance, chain migration, those things obviously to be this integral and with respect to national and foreign policy, I don't think that they've ever coupled them before.
Well, I do think that border security or trade have always been issues that are a part of our foreign policy and our dealings with foreign nations. But what I think is interesting about this document is it's an attempt to I guess, create or structure a coherent foreign policy idea around some of Trump's impulses. And I think what's going to be really interesting to see is whether the practice actually meets what's written down on the page. And I do have some concerns about that. I think this paper is absolutely right in identifying Russia, identifying China as bad actors, potential competition for us. But what we're seeing in practice, in some extents, is Russia taking the lead in Syria and Iraq. We're seeing the president occasionally being quite cordial to the leaders of China and Russia, and I think those are some inconsistencies that may have to be
Do you want
addressed.
them not to have a good relationship with them?
No, I think that you should have a good relationship, but at the same time, these are dictators. These are people that have murdered and imprisoned their people. It's not free regimes, and I want to see part of that foreign policy being putting America's commitment to freedom.
Well, also, Gina, President Trump talked about them as competitors beyond military competitors, particularly China. Over the next 10 years, it's going to be China and Russia and America, rather, vying for, influence over the entire planet. And I guess that's why President Trump talked about our value system as being something of a secret weapon, if you will.
It is a secret weapon, Charles. And I remember you and I discussing this going back to the early days of the campaign when we talked about how economic security and national security are inextricably linked. And that's why I'm so surprised today to read this. The things that he said today, that President Trump said, sounded almost like many of the reasons why many Americans voted for this president. And so I think he's, again, speaking the language of the guy on Main Street and not so much the guy on Wall Street. But the American economy and the American national security is like the tide that raises all boats. And it also causes these foreign leaders to respect this president. That's something we haven't had for the last 8 years, Charles, and I think it can have a dramatically positive impact on economic and national security worldwide.
Right. Rebecca, on the notion that we know that our two main rivals would be China and Russia, what kind of approach do we take with them? Because President Trump has obviously developed a pretty closer relationship with the Chinese premier, in part because of their joint effort to tamp down on North Korea. So is there some sort of delicate balancing act here, and does he have to saber rattle for you?
No, I think what the president is doing is right, and that is just he's trying to have cordial personal relations with these leaders while also being firm and clear about what he's going to do to pursue U.S. interests. That's the trade deals. Regarding Russia, in this national security strategy, the president says we're going to be expanding ballistic missile defense. That's something that the Russians have long opposed. That's something that the Obama administration capitulated on with the Russians. And so if you look at what we're doing, what are the policies that we're pursuing? We're pursuing policies that are in American interests, regardless of the opposition coming from China and Russia, without personally aggravating these leaders. I think that's the right approach. The details are going to be, we got to see it being implemented here. But if the president implements what's in this national security security strategy, this is a strong national security strategy that places American priorities first, the American homeland first, and it's going to be things that bother the Chinese and the Russians, but we've got to do them anyway.
What about also, Jillian, the idea that last week the administration talked about dumping climate change as a national security threat? I mean, that really was an integral part of the Obama administration. And I think, people sort of laughed at the idea that, you've got North Korea developing nuclear missiles, you've got China, you've got Russia, you've got ISIS, and yet we're kind of, put at the top of the list, climate change.
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the things I actually have really supported foreign policy-wise is pulling back from the Paris Climate Agreement. That was a place where the United States got a raw deal. We were agreeing to really dramatic scale backs of our carbon emissions, which has huge economic implications, huge competitiveness implications. And meanwhile, China was promising that they were going to keep increasing their carbon emissions for years. So I think starting from that position of parity, how is this going to hurt the economy? How do we get policies that are going to benefit the environment without hurting the American worker?
Right.
That's a much needed refocus.
And Gina, of course, President Trump talked about the economy, talked about the stock market. Can those be seen as by our adversaries as internal strength and actually be part of a national security platform? The idea that, hey, we're dealing with a very prosperous, optimistic nation.
Yes, because we know, Charles, that America doesn't operate in isolation. We understand what the president said today, that America first doesn't mean America alone. He has taken the facts over the feelings that we've heard so much about over the last 8 years, and he's trying to be realistic about it instead of idealistic. And I think that the rest of the country recognizes that, as you mentioned, threats like, climate change, which no one's ever really actually proven, versus terror or things that are of imminent danger to the whole entire world. It's just much better to focus on what we have in terms of real and tangible ways to fix the problems that threaten the whole entire world. And I believe the president has done so very coherently in this latest move. It's
Rebecca,
great.
where do we stand as the policeman of the world? How does that play vis-a-vis America first?
Well, what the president is trying to do is he doesn't want to be the policeman of the world. He wants the United States to be respected. He wants the United States to be able to engage when it's America's interest to engage. So that means, we want to defeat ISIS where ISIS exists. And by the way, the president has led a very successful anti-ISIS campaign in the short time he's been president, in Mosul, et cetera. And so we're going to be doing the things that are directly connected to the United States. We're not going to be intervening in wars of choice. And we're not going to be having unrealistic expectations about promoting democracies in nations that don't want to be democracies or are not self-governing themselves yet. So, again, but now I want to make a point clear, though. This does not mean that the president doesn't care about human rights. One of the best things we can do to expand and help human rights is to kill ISIS, to make sure North Korea doesn't have a nuclear ICBM capability that's reliable. And so these are the things that are tangible and imminent, and these are the things that we have to take care of.
Ladies, thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it. You guys are sort of simpatico when you came on today. Appreciate it. Talk to you all soon.